Welcome back. So now we are looking at missionary travelers during this period in history, kind of across the Silk Road. So unlike Ibn Battuta, who we saw yesterday, he was a Qadi and made sure that Islamic law was strictly enforced, and he made sure that Islamic law was um, followed to the letter. Sufi missionaries who traveled throughout the new Muslim territories that were conquered were a little more open. And if you look at your text at 508, um, they made sure that people were didn't necessarily make sure they're following Islam to a letter, but rather emphasized piety and devotion to Allah. Make sure that people had a relationship with Allah. And instead, they even tolerated traditional deities in regions like sub-Saharan Africa, where people practiced a lot of shamanism. So they were open to that, and they weren't as unyielding in terms of Islamic values and doctrine as maybe someone like Ibn Battuta. So they were ones that helped spread Islam and Islamic values as well. Um, and then Christianity was spreading across this region as well. And a lot of it came with missionaries accompanying crusaders. So we looked at in chapter 19, we saw the Crusades. And as soldiers ventured off into the Holy Land and into parts of Europe, especially southeastern Europe and the Balkans, look up a map if you don't know where the Balkans are, it's geography. You will see that when they accompanied the Crusaders to these places, they also brought Christianity with them. And if you look today, look at a map of religious makeup of the world, you'll see a lot of Christianity, even in the Balkan states, and some Islam as well, but mostly Christianity. And that had a lot to do with these Christian missionaries accompanying Crusaders. So Roman Catholic priests would travel east and establish expatriate communities. So you'd have these small communities of Christians in places that were, for the most part, not Christian. And one of the biggest ones and most well-known ones is Giovanni da Montecorvino. He was an Italian, and he traveled to China in 1291. He translated biblical texts into Turkic language, into Turkish, which was actually the court language of the Mongols. Remember, the Mongols brought a lot of advisors from Turkey, which they had conquered, back to the Mongol court in China. And they became pretty much the political advisors to the Khan. Well, Giovanni da Montecorvino, while he did baptize thousands of people in China, not many people in China really grasped onto Christianity as much as Christianity kind of attracted people in the Mediterranean. And there's several reasons for this. He was well respected. He wasn't hated by anybody, but Buddhism kind of offered a lot of the same things, especially to lower class people, in terms of it kind of treated everyone fairly. So it didn't latch on with people as much as probably he would have liked. He even tried to baptize the Khan himself and invited him to be baptized, but he was unsuccessful. Um, so you didn't see Christianity really grab hold in China as much as other parts of the world. Here's a picture of Giovanni da Montecorvino. If you look at the pictures, this one on the left is definitely in the Chinese style. It's probably on a silk print. And on the right, you even see some Chinese in the background. So you definitely can see that this is, a European in traditional Chinese garb. He's in the garb of a Chinese scholar, but he is 100% a Roman Catholic, dedicated to his faith. So along with this, you saw the exchange of narratives and stories in this region as well. And European troubadours, who were essentially kind of like your singer-songs person who would travel along with caravans of other Europeans, a lot of the love songs in Europe were actually taken from the Islamic world, interestingly enough. But more importantly is a lot of European scientists, when they began to move into the Muslim world, into the Middle East, They learned a lot from Jewish and Muslim societies. And this trade going back and forth between these regions following the Crusades and from the Silk Road, even before the Crusades, there were these exchanges taking place. Europe kind of started to emerge as a world superpower because they're getting a lot of the know-how from the Muslim world and the Jewish world, because they kind of served as the intermediaries between India and China and Europe. So as long as Europe was willing to exchange culturally with these places, they were going to emerge from the period known as the Middle Ages into what we would know as the Renaissance, which we haven't gotten to yet. We'll get to that later, where you'll see artwork becoming a lot more sophisticated, the use of gunpowder technology and warfare, the artwork. We just talked about artwork having more perspective. All of those things would start to emerge, and we'll talk about the Renaissance later. So here's an example of technology being spread. This is a technology from China. What you're looking at now is a compass. And the compass would change exploration dramatically. And Europeans would adopt all sorts of technology from the Far East and the Near East being the Middle East, in order to expand their abilities to trade and travel. Dowels, the use of lateen sails, the rudder, which is on the back of the ship, it kind of directs where it can go. All of these things were adopted in Europe and helped them to kind of emerge out of the Middle Ages. So very importantly is the spread of crops, and this is going to be especially important when we look at the Columbian Exchange later, but we'll get to that in a little bit. But what you need to understand is when you look at the exchange of foods and food crops across societies, it helps populations increase dramatically. So big things you saw being exchanged were citrus fruits, Asian rice, I should say rice, not rise, as well as cotton. And cotton would be a game changer in terms of, I hate that word, but I'm going to use it now, a game changer in terms of textiles and the creation of clothing. It helped the European world immensely, and the rest of the world as well. Sugarcane, pretty important, because this would be kind of the backbone for another period in history, and a dark period in history, which would be the expansion of the slave trade across the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. It went two ways. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. Muslims introduced crystallized sugar to the European world. So crystallized sugar was not indigenous to Europe. Europe didn't really have many spices. They didn't have sugar. So European food kind of was awful. Not just kind of, it was awful. It was bland. It was horrible. And then sugar showed up and it destroyed their teeth. So great. But anyways, demand increased rapidly. Okay, if you eat that bag of M&Ms, you're addicted, right? Sugar is addictive, so the Europeans wanted more and more. So the refined crystallized sugar would be in high demand from Europe, and because it made their food taste that much better. So Europeans began to establish these new trade cities and sugarcane plantations throughout the Mediterranean, because the Mediterranean was able to grow sugarcane. Well, they would also adopt something from the Muslim world, not just the sugar itself, but they would emulate the use of what the Islamic world was participating in was the use of slaves to work on sugarcane plantations. Yes, here's an image of sugar. Yeah, he looks pretty excited about weighing that sugar. It was probably a very valuable commodity, so he's kind of determining its weight to see how much it's worth. Great picture. Anyways, here is a image or a rendition of the Islamic trade of slaves that existed in this region. Most of them came from West Africa and ports like Zanzibar, and they would be mainly working in plantations, mainly sugarcane plantations. So Indian Ocean Basin had its slave trade, and then after the Europeans realized sugarcane is going to be very hard work, they employed the use of slavery on their plantations as well. So here's the slave trade routes in the Indian Ocean Basin, kind of prior to the expansion of it into the Mediterranean, where Europeans were, and then eventually across the Atlantic to the Americas, to South America and Brazil, or Mexico, or the Caribbean, any of those places. So transatlantic slave trade would come after all this. As you see, 1500 to 1900, slavery is utilized across the world, unfortunately, during this period in history, because people were just looking for profit. And that's unfortunately a lot of what drove the use of slavery. So, additionally, you had gunpowder technologies emerging from this period in time as well. And the ones who helped spread gunpowder technology across Eurasia was the Muslim world as well as the Mongol world. So the Mongols established this practice by employing Chinese to create gunpowder. Since you see fireworks oftentimes associated with Chinese culture and in Chinese celebrations, because they invented gunpowder. Gunpowder's been there for a long time. And as early as 1214, Genghis Khan's armies used artillery units. So they used explosives. They would lob these powder bombs into cities, which would essentially explode like it is, a bomb. It was quite awful. And probably horrific to see during that time, because no one had seen gunpowder before. So the technology would eventually reach Europe, because if they can make money off of it, they're going to sell it. So this technology eventually made its way into Europe, and that would change the world forever. We are still using gunpowder today, 900 years later. So it is quite a game changer. I said it again, in this period in history. So the movement of gunpowder would lead to a change in warfare. And I'll kind of reiterate on that, to expand on that. A lot of the traditional feudal societies, castle walls are relatively worthless now. Cannonball can just demolish that wall. Armor became obsolete. So you're not going to see men in these huge suits of armor anymore, or even chainmail, because it's worthless. A bullet or a mini ball or a cannonball is just going to just demolish that. So you see a vast change in the art of war. Here is kind of an example of the Mongol territory and how gunpowder probably would have spread across. It would have spread across it by sea as well as by land. So we are going to take a break here. We will pick up on this tomorrow with the Bubonic Plague, one of my personal favorites. Not really, but we'll pick up on this tomorrow. Thanks for listening. You guys have a great night.